Before we begin, I feel a need to set the record straight. My purpose in this podcast is simple: to set aside false traditions of our fathers, correct doctrines that never belonged to the restoration, and strengthen faith in Jesus Christ and the restoration of the gospel that he brought through Joseph Smith. Too many people have rejected that restoration because of polygamy, a polygamy that Joseph Smith never introduced or practiced. Today, we're clearing the record and reclaiming the truth. This is the saints, the standard of truth restored. In our last episode, we explored the Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo, a document that boldly condemned polygamy, spiritual wifery, and every related practice. In today's episode, we're taking a closer look at the narrative that early church leaders and current church historians want us to believe about the Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo. Modern church historians often place carefully crafted narratives before original documents that condemn polygamy to imply that Joseph was secretly teaching a divine, authorized form of plural marriage, while publicly condemning only the bad or unauthorized versions. We're going to break down that narrative and look at the sources themselves. We'll examine the claim that Joseph used carefully worded denials and that he taught select insiders while misleading the public, and that Emma and the Relief Society somehow contributed to the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram. These interpretations largely trace back to narratives promoted by Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, John Taylor, and others in Utah, not to Joseph himself. We're going to look directly at the narrative that the church historians press places directly before the Voice of Innocence. Then we're going to look at some documents to see if their narrative is correct and valid. We'll explore the language used in Nauvoo, the terms Joseph and his contemporaries applied, and the admissions by Utah leaders who openly called their practice polygamy and spiritual wifery. We'll show how later leaders misapplied Joseph's words to justify their own system, and how Emma Smith was an elect lady whose integrity deserves recognition, and how blaming the Relief Society for the martyrdom is both historically unfounded and unfair. By the end of this episode, you'll see why the historical record supports a very different story than the narrative. One where Joseph Smith opposed polygamy in all of its forms, and where later narratives reshaped that legacy to support the practice of polygamy in Utah. Let's get started. Something that I hear often in the comments sections of my videos, and also perpetuated by the church in most of their essays, and then also LDS church podcasters, and even in this narrative that we're about to read prior to the Voice of Innocence, is that they were just putting down spiritual wifery. They weren't talking about celestial plural marriage and or the doctrine of many wives and concubines. That's not what they were talking about. They were talking about John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system. And I think it's important for us to just have this conversation right now before we get into the narrative, that the document, the Voice of Innocence, and many of the other speeches by Joseph and Hiram talk about every name that it could be possibly mentioned underneath. And yes, spiritual wifery is mentioned multiple times, but people have perpetuated this, that it is never referred to as polygamy. It was celestial plural marriage. I want you to start your own research and look for when the first times they ever used the words celestial plural marriage or the doctrine of many wives and concubines. It was not until much later, years after Joseph Smith's death, where they started mentioning these things. They referred to it as spiritual wifery. They referred to it as polygamy. Now, many of the historians will try to lead you away from that. Many of the LDS podcasters will lead you away from that. And the church will tell you, no, that's not what it was referred to as. I guarantee it is, and I'm going to show you right here. Well, let's read from the Saints, Volume 1, Chapter 40. This is the history of the church. The saints who practiced plural marriage never referred to it as polygamy, which they considered a worldly term, not a priesthood ordinance. When Joseph or someone else condemned polygamy or spiritual wifery in public, those who practiced plural marriage understood that they were not referring to their covenant relationships. I decided just to compile a short list of how many times they actually referred to it as polygamy, because the Saints book, the history of the church, To me, I just can't think that the historians are that naive or that they didn't do their research enough to say this line. They never referred to it as polygamy. Because Brigham Young, 1866, you will be polygamists at least in your faith, or you will come short of enjoying the salvation and the glory which Abraham obtained. And those, once again, 1866, Journal Discourses, the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. But it is said, if you believe in polygamy, we cannot receive the gospel from your hands. Your polygamy in Utah is an honorable transaction. We marry our wives and we openly acknowledge them. Why do we believe and practice in polygamy? It's true, we have more wives than one, but polygamy, they are unconstitutionally opposing. Brigham Young, once again, 1866, I heard a revelation on polygamy and I believed it with all my heart. Other LDS leaders, Orson Pratt, the Lord has revealed the doctrine and principle of polygamy, and that was in 1852. 1869, Orson Pratt, as a people, we believe in polygamy. Heber C. Kimball, many of you think that you have embraced polygamy, but you've only done so in part. I am a firm believer in the doctrine of polygamy, Heber C. Kimball says. George Q. Cannon talks about polygamy. Our people are persecuted for obeying the doctrine, polygamy. They called the doctrine polygamy. John Taylor, we are accused of practicing polygamy. That is true. We do it because God commanded it. I obey the law of polygamy because I'm commanded of God. Wilford Woodruff, the doctrine of polygamy. I'm a believer in the revelation on polygamy. Orson Hyde, we have embraced polygamy. So for the Saints book, you get my point. For the Saints book to say that they never referred to it as polygamy is absolutely false. And remember, the Voice of Innocence says, let polygamy, bigamy, fornication, adultery, and prostitution be frowned out of the hearts of innocent men. So to say that's not what they were talking about is exactly what they were talking about. Let polygamy be frowned out of the hearts of innocent men. Okay, let's talk about the term spiritual wifery. And I can guarantee, I'm just going to use one example, but I can guarantee that spiritual wifery is what a lot of the wives were known by. Polygamy and spiritual wifery is what these things were known by. We're going to go to a website called Mormon Polygamy Documents. This website is owned and operated by Brian Hales. Brian Hales is actually an anesthesiologist, but he claims to be kind of the authoritative figure on Joseph Smith's polygamy, and the church uses him in many instances. Now, this Mormon Polygamy Documents website is actually fantastic. He has done so much research. So while I appreciate his research, I do not appreciate his conclusions that Joseph Smith was a liar or offering carefully worded denials and that he was going behind Emma's back and doing these things. I don't get that from these documents, but I am grateful that he has these documents available for everybody to go and read and research. But let's talk about that term spiritual wifery real quick here before we get into the narrative. Emily Dow Partridge Young, she was a plural wife of Brigham Young. She says this on July 29th, 1881. Sunday, today I've been thinking. My mind goes back to days gone by. My life has been like a panorama of disagreeable pictures. I have been heart hungry all my life. Do you just feel her pain? I think this is what Jacob was talking about in the Book of Mormon, about how it breaks the hearts of women. Goes on, I am, as the world calls it, a spiritual wife of early days, when public opinion was like an avalanche bearing all beneath its oppressive weight. Some will understand what it is to be a woman, mother, or an unloved spiritual wife. There's actually many women who refer to themselves as spiritual wives. And maybe one day we'll get into where that term spiritual wife came from. But for now, I just think it's important that we can no longer say, well, that's not what he was talking about. That's not what Joseph was saying. He was condemning spiritual wifery, but that's not what he was doing. Okay, well, Joseph Smith wasn't doing any of that, and he condemned it. Spiritual wifery and polygamy is what it was referred to. So we need to stop saying that's not what it was being practiced by Brigham Young, John Taylor, Orson Pratt, Wilford Woodruff, and many others. So like I said before, today we are going to be talking about the narrative that is put prior to the transcript for the Voice of Innocence. If you haven't watched the Voice of Innocence video from last week, you want to go see that one first before you see this one. This is kind of like a part 2 to that. Today what we're going to be discussing is not actually the Voice of Innocence, which is found down here in the middle of the page. It's actually, what we're going to talk about is all this stuff before they actually get into the transcript for the Voice of Innocence. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has multiple websites where you can find good documents. The Joseph Smith Papers is my favorite. The Church Historians Press is also very good because they have transcribed a lot of old documents onto the Church Historians Press. And they even contain the editing marks and those things. So you can actually see what the original would have looked like compared to what it is now. I really enjoy that, and I'm grateful for them doing that. What I'm not grateful for in many instances is the narratives that they give before the document. And the reason I say that is because whether intentionally or unintentionally, they create a bias before the document is ever able to be seen by the viewer. And this is done on the church owned website, the Joseph Smith Papers Project. They will usually paint a narrative and create a bias prior to you reading the document so you can sort your way through the church's narrative and make sure you maintain that narrative rather than letting the document speak for itself. Like I said, whether this is done intentionally or unintentionally, it is done with bias. And unfortunately, it's because the church historians are paid employees, and they're paid by the church to maintain a narrative and to help people understand the church's narrative. They're not here to be open-ended and let you decide what the story should have been, but to maintain that church's narrative. So let's dive right in here. The very first paragraph. Joseph Smith and a small group of his trusted associates who had privately entered into plural marriages considered their relationships to be holy matrimony, sealed or confirmed by divine authority and approval. Joseph Smith's 1843 revelation regarding plural marriage specified that he was the sole possessor of the authority for the performance of such marriages. So before we get into the document where it is in complete opposition to polygamy, plural marriage, adultery, spiritual wifery, all of these things, bigamy, it paints a picture that this is not what they were talking about. Joseph was authorized with a few of his close associates to do it, but the rest of the church wasn't authorized, and that's what they were condemning in the Voice of Innocence. So within the first paragraph, it already starts to paint a bias. This, in my opinion, can be refuted pretty easily. Doctrine and Covenants section 132 was not added to the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. And at that point, the revelation on marriage was actually taken out of the Doctrine and Covenants because there was a revelation on monogamy in the Doctrine and Covenants in the 1835 and 1844 editions of the Doctrine and Covenants. That was removed, and the doctrine of many wives and concubines was added as talked about in section 132. And in section 132, it states that Joseph is the only one who has the authority to authorize plural marriages. What I find interesting is an October 5th, 1843 journal entry. This was about 3 months after the supposed revelation on plural marriage was given, July 12th, 1843, that Joseph recorded this in his journal. Let's go to that document in the Joseph Smith Papers real quick. Okay, so we have here the October 5th, 1843 journal entry. This is in the handwriting of Willard Richards, who was one of the scribes for Joseph Smith at the time. And if we scroll down here, you can read Thursday, October 5th, talks about what he did in the morning. And then he says, we're starting here. Evening at home, walked up and down with scribe, and gave instruction to try those who were teaching the doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law, Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. He is very clear in an October 5th, 1843 journal entry that he doesn't condone anybody who has more than one wife. In fact, he was to try those. And as you look through the historical record, people were tried and they were excommunicated and cut off from the church for practicing or even preaching the plurality of wives. Notice they don't say John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system here or anything like that. I think that's important to note. They say plurality of wives. Now, this was a journal entry from October, and he had supposedly received Doctrine and Covenants section 132 about the plurality of wives in July of that year. So this is 3 months later that he's saying, no, that's not okay. Interestingly enough, this very journal entry made it into the manuscript history of the church, where space was left for it to be changed. We'll probably do a video on that sometime. I've actually covered it in some of my previous videos. And then when it finally makes it into the history of the church, it says something very different. It says, unless I say so. Pretty much, no man shall have more than one wife unless I say so. However, Joseph didn't write that. So that's something to be noted. Picking up where we left off in the Church Historian Press, at the word however here in the middle of the screen. However, as knowledge of the practice of plural marriage spread, it prompted counterfeit practices and abuse, such as John C. Bennett's notion of spiritual wifery. Publicly addressing these dangers posed a significant challenge for the Relief Society leaders in Nauvoo. Once again, the bias points us back to this was just talking about spiritual wifery. It wasn't talking about other forms of plural marriage like Joseph and his associates were practicing. Okay, I don't know how we can be more clear. Joseph in October says the plurality of wives. In this document, the Voice of Innocence that we're talking about today, they say polygamy, bigamy, fornication, adultery, and they also mention, yes, John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system, but not just John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system, but every other name under the book that you could use. So right here, what they're doing is they're painting the picture for us. They're making it so, okay, so this is what's going on. So the Relief Society had a really hard time, so they had to be careful in the language that they used. Remember, this document, the Voice of Innocence, was not just a Relief Society document. It was actually read to the saints before it was ever read to the Relief Society, and we'll get into that in a minute. Back to the reading. From the Relief Society's first meeting, President Emma Smith emphasized the group's responsibility to watch over the morals and be very careful of the character and reputation of the members of the institution. As the practice of plural marriage slowly expanded, the Relief Society was drawn into disputes involving the gap between public pronouncements against spiritual wifery and the private practice of authorized plural marriage. I really would like to know where they're getting their information for authorized plural marriages. Because, as we just showed, after the supposed revelation was received on plural marriage, Joseph was still condemning it. Okay, so I've never seen anything where it's authorized by Joseph Smith. Now, was it being practiced in Nauvoo? Yes, it was. At this time, we know that John C. Bennett had done it. We know that Heber C. Kimball. We know that Brigham Young and some others in England on their missions had started indulging in this practice. In 1842, 19 Relief Society members published a statement refuting Bennett's claims that the church promoted a secret wife system. Over the next 2 years, more rumors of polygamy and spiritual wifery buzzed through Nauvoo and the surrounding area. Let's be clear, those rumors were true and they were going on. Obviously, because Joseph, in a letter in 1842 to the Relief Society, he told them that this was going on and that people were using his name to trick women into polygamous relationships. And let's go ahead and go to that document now.
So the earliest record that we have of this comes from the Nauvoo Relief Society Minute Book. It actually wasn't recorded in the Minute Book until September of 1842, and they explain that was because the secretary was not present to write it down. But the letter is dated March 31st, 1842. It's in Eliza Snow's handwriting. You can see it here. And it appears that the letter was given to the Relief Society to record in the minute book, so they had a record of it. What's really interesting is this letter specifically addresses the men in the community who were trying to trick women into polygamous relationships. This is an important part right in the middle of the screen of the letter. I would encourage you to read the whole letter, but this is a really important part. Shall the credulity, good faith, and steadfast feelings of our sisters for the cause of God or truth be imposed upon by believing such men, because they say they have authority from Joseph or the first presidency or any other presidency of the church, and thus with a lie in their mouth deceive and debauch the innocent under the assumption that they are authorized from these sources? May God forbid. A knowledge of some such things have come to our ears. We improve this favorable opportunity, wherein so a goodly number of you may be informed that no such authority has, this is really important, you guys, has, ever can, or ever will be given to any man. And if any man has been guilty of such a thing, let him be treated with utter contempt, and let the curse of God fall on his head, and let him be turned out of society as an unworthy place among men, and denounced as the blackest and most unprincipled wretch, and finally, let him be damned. He doesn't mess around with words there. That's not a carefully worded denial. He says that no man has ever had this authority, never can, and never will be given this authority to allow people to have polygamous relationships. We're going to go on down in this letter a little bit. Right in the middle of the screen, we do not want anyone to believe anything as coming from us, contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regarding the habits and customs and conduct of society. And all persons pretending to be authorized by us or having any permit or sanction from us are and will be liars and base impostors. And you are authorized on the very first imitation of such a kind to denounce them as such, and shun them as the fiery flying serpent, whether they are prophets, seers, or revelators, patriarchs, 12 apostles, elders, priests, mayors, generals, city councilors, aldermen, marshals, police, lord mayors, or the devil are all alike culpable and shall be damned for such evil practices. Does it show that they leave any room for, well, if it comes from Joseph, then it's okay because he has the authority? No, it says any prophets, seers, revelators, and calls them flying fiery serpents. Now, it goes on here, and if you yourselves adhere to anything of the kind, you also shall be damned. Now, beloved sisters, do not believe for a moment that we wish to impose upon you. We actually do know that such things have existed in the church, and are sorry to say that we are obliged to make mention of anything, and we want a stop put to them. And we desire you to do your part, and we will do ours, for we wish to keep the commandments of God in all things, as given directly from heaven, living by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord. I think this is a really awesome letter because it doesn't leave any room for anybody to say, well, if it came from Joseph, it's okay. It's very interesting that the record that ended up in the history of the church for this letter actually changes the spot where it says, whether it be prophet, seer, revelator, quorum of the 12, mayor, lord mayor, anything like that. It's very interesting. It actually changes it to say this. Let's jump over to that document because we can actually find it right here on the Joseph Smith papers. Okay, almost word for word here, starting right in the middle of the screen. We don't want anybody to believe anything as coming from us, contrary to the old established morals and virtues and scriptural laws regarding the habits and customs and the conduct of society. Unless it be by message delivered to you by our own mouth, by actual revelation and commandment. And all persons pretending to be authorized by us or having permit or sanction, and then it goes on to the fiery flying serpents, whether they be prophets, seers, revelators, patriarchs. It's pretty interesting because it says, unless it be by message delivered to you by our own mouth. That was not in the original letter to the Relief Society. This came much later. So obviously there was some more editing done to this letter after Joseph Smith's death. Let's go back to the Voice of Innocence and continue to read the narrative. So continuing to read the narrative right in the middle of the screen, on February 26, 1844, a man named Orsimus F. Bostwick was brought before the mayor's court in Nauvoo and fined for slander. Bostwick had claimed that Hiram Smith had spiritual wives and that many women in Nauvoo were involved with spiritual wifery, promiscuity, and prostitution. 2 days later, William W. Phelps, a printer who sometimes acted as Joseph's clerk and ghostwriter, and who also served as city clerk and assisted in keeping the church history, was writing on Orsimus F. Bostwick for women. Whether for women means at the request of women or on behalf of women is not clear. Phelps' document titled The Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo was then copied by Thomas Bullock, a clerk for Joseph Smith. Voice of Innocence gave Relief Society women a means for responding to insulting rumors and the allegations of Bostwick and others. This is really important right here, you guys. On March 7th, in a public meeting at the Nauvoo Temple before an audience of about 8,000 members of the church. So this was not just to the Relief Society. Joseph Smith denounced Bostwick and asked the large assembly to speak out and say whether such men should be tolerated and supported in our midst. At this meeting, Phelps read aloud the Voice of Innocence, to which the assembly responded by saying Amen twice. During an afternoon continuation of that meeting, notice was given for the Relief Society to meet the following Saturday to adopt the statement written by Phelps. That's all really good. I think that's pretty accurate history in that paragraph. I think that's really good. At some point, Emma made some alterations to Bullock's copy of The Voice of Innocence. That is true. And last week when we did The Voice of Innocence and we read through it, you can actually see those edits. They were very minor edits, but there was some editing made. That copy is used below as the featured text. On March 9th, 1844, Smith read her slightly amended version at the meeting of the Relief Society held that year. She spoke on Bostwick's controversy, and the assembled members of the Relief Society unanimously voted that they were willing to receive the principles of virtue and keep the commandments of God and uphold the president in putting down iniquity. Smith further expressed that her determination was to do her duty effectually in putting down transgression. I think that is all very good. Emma made it very clear that it was her duty as the Relief Society president and the women's duty as mothers to put down this iniquity. It's really clear in the minutes of the meetings that were held. And we do have that in the Relief Society Minute Book as well. Let's continue on reading. Since the meeting room could not accommodate all the members of the Relief Society who wished to attend, Emma Smith presided over 3 more meetings, one on the afternoon of March 9th and 2 on March 16th, that all approved the Voice of Innocence. On March 16th, Smith denounced John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system and exhorted the Relief Society members to cleanse their hearts and ears and to throw the mantle of charity around to shield those who will repent and do so no more. She called for a reformation in both men and women. Up to this point, I think the narrative is really good again. So we had a little bit of stuff in the beginning. Narrative changes is really good. I think it's accurate information. And then we start to create another bias here. And I wish they wouldn't do that. I wish they would just let the history tell itself. I'm okay with narratives as long as we don't create the bias. And I know people will accuse me of creating a bias, But all I'm doing is refuting the bias that they implanted into this. Let's continue reading here. By this point, Emma Smith opposed plural marriage as practiced by her husband and others in Nauvoo. So once again, they just go right back into, well, Joseph was doing this, even though he said he wasn't, and even though he was telling other men not to, and even though he was telling everybody that even if somebody comes to you and says that they have been authorized by Joseph not to believe it, he actually still was doing it. I really have a hard time with that. Like, can we not just believe Joseph Smith? Anyway, right here in the middle of the screen. She thus encouraged Relief Society members to follow the published statements of Joseph Smith and the church, as well as her husband's teachings, quote, from the stand, unquote. Implying, and I love that because how do we know what Emma Smith was implying? But they're saying that she's implying that they should abide by his public remarks against spiritual wifery rather than any private teachings regarding plural marriage. We have hearsay that talks about Joseph Smith's private teachings. We have enemies of the church that talk about private teachings. What I think is incredible, not in a good way incredible, but what is incredible is that they continue to say that Joseph was teaching privately when he has made all of these claims that he wasn't teaching these things privately, that he never would teach any of these things privately, that nobody has ever been authorized or will be authorized to teach these things privately. And then in June of 1844, right before he died, he clarified that and he said this. Let's go to the Joseph Smith papers once again and read from that sermon of June 1844. So here in the Joseph Smith papers, we have a discourse from June 16th, 1844, reported by Thomas Bullock. You can see his handwriting here. And as we scan through this document, he's actually talking about how God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost are three separate and distinct beings. But he mentions something in here because he's accused of being kind of two-faced by preaching one thing in private and doing something else. But he says, I am bold to declare, right here in the middle of the screen, I am bold to declare that I've always taught the strong doctrines publicly and always teach stronger than what I teach in private. I think it's really important that Joseph Smith clarifies that right here, that I am bold to declare I have always taught the strong doctrines publicly and always stronger than what I teach in private. All right, so back to the narrative. I think that this next paragraph is very historically accurate and good. It says, the version of Voice of Innocence amended by Emma Smith and read to the Relief Society was then published in the Nauvoo Neighbor on March 20th, 1844. Above the names of Emma Smith and Hannah M. Ells, Secretary Pro Tem of the Relief Society, the article included a brief introduction that explained at 4 overflowing meetings of the ladies of the Nauvoo, members of the Female Relief Society, each meeting being composed of different members, that all might have the opportunity of expressing their feelings, held at General Smith's large assembly room on Saturdays, the 9th and 16th of March, 1844. The following preamble and resolutions were read unanimously and adopted at each meeting. All really good. And then we get back into a little bit of bias here. And it's a little confusing because it does mix truth, but skews it to make it appear as something it's not. Let's go ahead and read that one as well. Publication of the Voice of Innocence possibly fanned the flames of the swelling firestorm over plural marriage in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith continued to be the subject of accusations from critics within and outside the church, some threatening legal action against him. On May 26, 1844, he addressed the saints in a long sermon describing the hypocrisies of his traducers and noted that he never had any fuss with these men until that Female Relief Society brought out the paper against adulterers and adulteresses. I think this is really important to point out here that they take a segment of Joseph Smith's speech on May 26, 1844, out of context. And we're going to go to that document here in a minute. But we have to remember that it wasn't just the Female Relief Society that brought out this paper. It was also read to the saints in a meeting of 8,000 people. But it creates a bias when we say this out of context. Let's go ahead and go to that document and let's talk about what happened in that document. Okay, so we have here the discourse on May 26, 1844, as compiled by Leo Hawkins. Joseph Smith was kind of getting a little sarcastic even in this sermon because he was being accused of all sorts of things. And for the most part, he was being accused of adultery. We're going to view the entire transcript because it's easier to go through here. He was being accused of spiritual wifery and adultery. And he talks about how clerks followed him around and people followed him around. He's like, if I was doing these things, people would know about it. They would have written it down. But he continues to go on, and this is one of my favorite parts that he says here, right in the middle of the screen. God knows then that the charges against me are false. I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. I mean to live as long as I can, and this new holy prophet, meaning William Law, had gone to Carthage and sworn that told him I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifism, why a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this. And he goes on and he says that William Law and also William Law, his brother, testified against him that he was guilty of adultery. And then here is the great part. We're going to get into where the historians take that little portion about, well, I never had any fuss with these people until the Relief Society brought it out against them. We're going to get into that right here. I wish the grand jury would tell me who they are, meaning the wives that he supposedly had, whether it will be a curse or a blessing to me. I am quite tired of the fools asking me. A man asked me whether the commandment was given that a man may have 7 wives. And now the new prophet, once again that's William Law, has charged me with adultery. I never had any fuss until that Female Relief Society brought out the paper against adulterers and adulteresses. Dr. William Goforth was invited to the Law's clique, and Dr. Foster and the clique were dissatisfied with that document, and they rushed away to take away my life because I will not countenance such wickedness. So here we have multiple people accusing Joseph Smith of adultery and having all these wives, and he's like, I wish you would tell me who they are. And then he goes into that portion where he says, I never had any fuss with these men until the Female Relief Society brought out the paper against adulterers and adulteresses. Did that paper light a fire underneath the apostates that ultimately led to the death of Joseph Smith? Yes, it did. But we have to remember that it wasn't what Joseph was saying here. Yes, the Female Relief Society brought out paper against adulterers and adulteresses, and the wicked take the truth to be hard. Remember in the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi chapter 16, verse 3, I believe it is, where it says the wicked take the truth to be hard. Then all these apostates got mad. They were dissatisfied with the document, and they rushed away to take away Joseph Smith's life. Joseph goes on and he talks about Wilson Law also swears that he was guilty of adultery. And what we have to remember is that Wilson Law and William Law were both known adulterers. And this is a really important part. Are we going to believe the voices of the apostates, or are we going to believe what Joseph says? He says, right in the middle of the screen, I have been chained. I have rattled chains before. I am innocent of all these charges, and you can bear witness. When I love the poor, I ask no favors of the rich. I can go to the cross. I can lay down my life, but don't forsake me. Are we going to forsake Joseph and believe the testimony of traitors? Or are we going to believe him? He goes on, What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can only find one. I am the same man, and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. And I think he would have proved them all perjurers had he not died a month later. In a lot of ways, I don't blame the church historians for just repeating the narrative that they've always been told. However, I do think it's some historical negligence on their part not to accurately report all the events and just report the narrative. But the narrative comes from people they trust. For example, right here on the church library app, you can go to the first 50 years of Relief Society, and you can actually see some excerpts from Brigham Young's discourses about a year after Joseph Smith's death. Now, these excerpts are actually taken from a year to the day that it was first read to the Relief Society. The Voice of Innocence was first read to the Relief Society. But we got to remember that on March 7th, 2 days before it was read to the Relief Society, it was read to 8,000 saints in Nauvoo. If we go down, first let's just kind of talk about, once again, there's a narrative. We always have to have a narrative, right, leading up to it. They talk about how Brigham Young was kind of raised in a rough and frontier environment, which kind of led him to be the coarse person that he was. But if we go to the middle of the screen, it says, John Taylor later reported, Sister Emma got severely tried in her mind about the doctrine of plural marriage, and she made use of the position she held to try to pervert the minds of the sisters in relation to the doctrine. So these historians are just going off of what people like John Taylor and Brigham Young said. But then the historians elaborate on this and say, Emma Smith expressed her opposition to plural marriage in her calls for a reformation in morals at the Relief Society meetings on March 9th and March 16th, 1844, in which the society endorsed the Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo. Brigham Young believed that Emma Smith's efforts to thwart the practice of plural marriage contributed to the furor against Joseph and Hiram Smith and helped lead to their deaths. Once again, I need to drive this home. They made no mention of the meeting that happened with 8,000 saints on March 7th, where Joseph Smith spoke and then the Voice of Innocence was read. And instead, they continue to perpetuate this narrative that it was Emma Smith and her opposition to plural marriage and the Relief Society reading the Voice of Innocence that led to the death of Joseph and Hiram. Later on in this same article, where we actually get into the discourses by Brigham Young, it says here, March 9th, 1845, President Brigham Young spoke. So remember, this is a year after Joseph's death. Relief Society going to meet again? I say I will curse every man that lets his wife or daughters meet again until I tell them. What are relief societies for? To relieve us of our best men. So can you blame the historians for saying what they do? Because Brigham Young just said here that the Relief Society led to the death of Hiram and Joseph. He says, they relieved us of Hiram and Joseph. That is what they will do. I don't want the advice or counsel of any woman. They would lead us down to hell. There is no woman on the face of this earth that can save herself, but if she ever comes into the celestial kingdom, she must be led in by some man. God knew what Eve was. To me, this I find pretty offensive, that Brigham Young would say this about Eve, our first mother. He was acquainted with woman thousands and millions of years before. He made a few remarks in relation to the revival of the Female Relief Society and disprobated it. Many members of our church don't realize that Brigham Young, a year after Joseph Smith's death, disbanded the Relief Society for over 20 years. It was in response to the blame that he was putting on Emma and the Relief Society for Joseph and Hiram's deaths. Later that evening, he gave a discourse to the 70s where he said, President Brigham Young arose and he said he would make remarks relative to the thing which many of our sisters have been engaged. They have no right to meddle in the affairs of the kingdom of God. Outside the pale of this, they have a right to meddle because many of them are more sagacious and shrewd and more competent to attend to things of financial affairs. They never can hold the keys of the priesthood apart from their husbands. When I want sisters or the wives or the members of this church to get up the Relief Society, I will summon them to my aid. But until that time, let them stay at home. And if you see females huddling together, veto the concern. And if they say Joseph started it, tell him it's a damned lie, for I know that he never encouraged it. But I know where the chit was laid, and I am determined to stay these proceedings, for by it our best men have been taken from us. 1 ounce of preventative is better than 1 pound of cure. So once again, he blamed the Relief Society for what happened to Joseph and Hiram. I think something that we need to address while we're talking about this, we're still here in the Gospel Library app. We're actually underneath November's Come Follow Me lessons. They do a little section on the voices of the restoration. And historians and the people who are compiling these things for Come Follow Me and our lessons, I think have historically tried to leave Emma out of the picture or paint her in a negative light. And so under the Voices of the Restoration section in the Come Follow Me manual, it talks about the Relief Society. What's interesting, if you read this whole article, it talks about the organization of the Relief Society. It has a painting here of the Relief Society, and it talks about Eliza Snow. And you're like, well, what about Emma? Emma's the one who was the one who was in charge of organizing the Relief Society. But you go on, and it shows a picture of the Relief Society being organized in the upstairs of the red brick store. That was also Emma Smith. But there was no mention of Emma in this entire article. I think that as a church, we need to stop putting down the family and the wife of the prophet Joseph Smith and recognize her for the elect lady she is. It's interesting. It talks about elect lady here. You can see this. And it's under whose name? Eliza Snow. Now, I'm not saying that she was not an elect lady at times in her life. What I'm saying is that elect lady was specifically given to Emma by the Lord in the Doctrine and Covenants. And we've done a pretty good job as a church of systematically removing her and Joseph's family and the importance of his family in the restoration.
So when we strip away the later narratives, the assumptions, and the retroactive justifications, the record becomes clear. Joseph and Hiram stood against polygamy in every form of it, and Emma Smith stood with them. The truth was never hidden. It was overwritten. And it's time we let Joseph's own voice, not Brigham's, have the final word. Until next time, this is the Saints, the Standard of Truth Restored.